Welcome to the Pier.
It was the same yesterday. Their hours finish at 4:30.
The first pier was built in 1812 at Weymouth, with the island's right pier following 2 years later in 1814.
Yeah, that's right.
With the introduction of the first paddle steamers and locomotives in the 1820s, travel soon became much easier and cheaper, and the Bank Holiday Act of 1871 enabled working classes to enjoy a day trip to the seaside.
The castle is there. It's 12th century.
During the 1860s and 1870s, on average, 2 new piers were opening each year. Seaside piers enjoyed enormous popularity as visitors discovered the delight of walking out over the sea and enjoying the sea breezes. During World War II, many piers were sectioned, and by the time the war ended, several had fallen into a state of disrepair due to neglect and damage. At the turn of the last century and well into the 1950s, the Isle of Wight boasted 8 pleasure piers dotted around its coastline. The construction of Wight Pier was commenced in 1813 and was completed in 1814. It was in fact 3 piers in one. A promenade pier for pedestrians and vehicles was built in 1840. A tramway was added to the pier in 1864. And finally the railway section was completed in 1880.
Well, what's great that it's been known for, I mean, there's the villa, but that's not really one's house, is it? No, it isn't. And you can go there and buy our very occasionally. It's Victorian, it wasn't very small, but that's I still think in my head that this place is shutting. It's nearly all my life, I know. Who's the holiday?
True back on the prize, isn't it?
32 years. Oh, I've been making notes. I'm even now. The camera is running next to the.
Wight Pier's middle tramway section is no longer in use and has been partially dismantled.
I haven't made one of that. I have a feeling that's probably a generic video of all sorts of footage of cars and things rather than specific to this.
Yes, it is.
But I've got all sorts. The audio is still running that little piece on the speaker.
Wight Pier is the longest in England after Southend, at 2,250 feet. That's almost half a mile.
Are you on email? Right. Okay, that's fine. Because although it's not done yet, the intention is to put up a website with everything so you can actually click anything down.
There were entertainment facilities at the pier end, including a theatre and bar. On the pier itself, there were a number of small pavilions and boat launching ramps. All of these are now, unfortunately, gone.
No, she was. The thing is, I was chatting to her, and then I was speaking to other staff, and she thought I was going down there. It wasn't unpleasant, though. So it's all right. Which one was something so I was using my email address. I don't want to give my Philip Hutchinson's email.
Seaview Pier was opened in 1881. Its suspension construction was 1,000 feet long.
That's very fun. Thank you.
It saw regular calls by pleasure steamers and occasional ferries until the Second World War. During the war, it was allowed to become dilapidated, despite becoming the first British pier to become listed as a building of historic interest. It was destroyed during a storm at the end of 1950.
On the 3rd of January.
On the 1st of January.
Sandown Pier was opened in 1879. It is 875 feet long and was originally a landing pier for paddle steamers. Paddle steamers called regularly at the pier head until the Great War of 1914. Bathing was allowed at the pier head, and at the bottom of the pier, several bathing machines were in constant use.
Yeah, so there'll be all these audio clips. I mean, I can use the internet like most people, so make notes.
In 1875, a pavilion was added at the seaward end. A new pavilion was built at the land end in 1934. The old pavilion at the seaward end was demolished when the pier was rebuilt in the late 1960s.
Okay. So, the other thing is it's the blog. You actually did that directly yourself, because I've got a book coming out next year. I'm an author.
The new pavilion has in recent years been converted from a theatre to an entertainment complex.
I'm a massive enthusiast of the Lost Black Gang Road. That was stretch of the underbit from basically from the story of the news. All that thing, yeah, all of it. But
Shanklin Pier was built in the late 1880s. It was not a financial success and was put up for sale in 1892. The local council bought it and a pavilion theatre was built. This had regular shows starring the big names of the time, and the pier was also a regular calling point for pleasure steamers, including those operating day trips to France.
Friend will be waiting for you, Jenna.
No, she's going to come back this way. No, she's going around to look at the animals, Roger. That will take a while.
I won't be able to take the dog.
No, well, it doesn't matter. We'll go in the garden. Jeremy will take him later.
Shanklin Pier returned to private ownership in 1925. and it thrived until the 1970s, when frequent changes of ownership led to its decline. Despite attempts to repair the structure, it came as no surprise when it was destroyed in a storm in 1987. Various proposals were put forward to rebuild it, but unfortunately these came to nothing, and the remains were eventually demolished. There have been 3 piers at Ventnor. The first, built in the 1860s, part of an ill-fated harbour scheme, was destroyed by the end of that decade. The second was opened in 1871, rebuilt in 1881, and destroyed at the end of the same year. The third pier was named the Royal Victoria Pier, after Queen Victoria. It had a pavilion at its head, it was used for entertainment, and it saw regular visits from pleasure steamers. The Royal Victoria Pier was rebuilt in 1955 with a new pavilion. The shore end was subsequently covered over and used for amusement machines. Fire caused damage to the shore end in 1985. Repair was not considered practical, and the whole structure was demolished in 1993. Allen Bay is famous for its coloured sands. The Allen Bay Pier opened in 1887 and was basically a long landing stage. Roughly 370 feet long, there was a cafe at its entrance and a gift shop on the shore. It was a landing point for pleasure steamers, both from the mainland and from the island. It declined after the First World War and was declared unfit and closed in 1924. In 1927 it was damaged by a storm, but the remnants were visible well into the 1960s.
It's going to be tricky getting that car out. It's still blocked in the dark.
I expect other people have gone with them.
The Totland Hotel and Pier Company built Totland Pier in 1880, and its fortunes were very much connected with theirs. Its main use was for pleasure steamers, and this continued well into the 1960s. With the decline of the traditional holiday trade, the steamers no longer called, and the Totland Hotel was demolished. The pier was sold, but none of the owners kept it in a usable state, and it is now derelict. It was sold for £19,500 in October 1997. The new owner is hoping to restore it. Fort Victoria Pier was built in the 1850s to service various military installations in the West Wight and was used as such until 1962. It had a small tramway and a crane at its head. Attempts to demolish it have been made, but for legal reasons this has not yet been accomplished. Yarmouth Pier was opened in 1876 and is 685 feet long with a long wooden structure. A pavilion was added in 1927. It was used for steamers, including the ferry service from Lymington, until the car ferry was introduced. It is now used by a variety of smaller pleasure craft. The pier became a listed building in 1975, and it has subsequently been restored at a cost of more than £600,000. There have been 3 piers at Cowes. Fountain Pier was built around 1840 and was removed around 1893. The pontoon, which is still used for the high-speed service to Southampton, replaced it. The Royal Pier was built in the late 1860s, but was washed away 16 years later in 1876. The Victoria Pier was opened in 1902. It was 170 feet long. With a high maintenance cost to blame, as with other island piers, it unfortunately became derelict. The pavilion was demolished in 1951 and the remainder in 1961 and 1962.
Yeah, there's a Facebook group. Yeah, I've been on all weekend.
As package holidays abroad became cheaper, fewer visitors to our own resorts meant less income for the ornate Victorian piers, which were costly to maintain, and over the years more and more have fallen to the toll of time, the sea and the weather. Nowadays, just a few dozen resort piers survive, but they still provide pleasure for many visitors.